We say culture is important, culture matters. Well, how?
We're powered by our brains. We're not always rational. We are influenced by others.
I think I'd start with looking at what's called the better than average effect.
So one of the things we look for picking flight directors is what we call command presence, right? You kind of just look at people like, you better get it together. We got stuff to do, right?
Good practice would be for a leader to say, well, this is a mistake I made recently, and this is what I did about it.
I can't emphasize enough the disempowerment of the lonely decision maker.
So the opposite of what we think of as an ethical decision frame, we can think of as a game frame.
It doesn't make you unethical to wrestle with this. The smart money is we help you to try to figure this out.
This is Banknotes, Banking Culture Reform. The views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System.
Hi, and welcome to the Banking Culture Reform podcast, part of the New York Fed's initiative to drive awareness and change in financial services culture. This series, Norms, Mindsets, and Decision-Making, explores questions like, why do ethical people do unethical things? How can organizations encourage staff to speak up and executives to listen up? And what role does context play in shaping people's behavior? My name is Toni DiCario, and I'm a member of the New York Fed's culture team. Our guest today is Mark Mortenson. Mark's an associate professor of organizational behavior at INSEAD. He studies collaboration, team dynamics, and communication. We first featured Mark as a panelist in our webinar on culture in a post-pandemic workplace. In this episode, Mark tells us what drew him from engineering to behavioral science, why we can't rely on rules to drive good decisions, and the critical importance of psychological safety in building strong cultures. Thanks for joining us, Mark, and welcome.
Thanks, Toni. I'm really glad to be here.
So what drew you to study organizational behavior in the first place, and specifically to be interested in how teams function and team dynamics?
It's the classic story, right? It's navel gazing. So I have to start by saying I'm an organizational behavior guy, but I'm actually a recovering engineer. So I started off my career doing computer science, trying to build different technologies. And honestly, what happened was we'd put out technology. Of course, our technology was perfect. We never made mistakes, but things went wrong. And, I'd hand something over to you and you'd start doing stuff. And after a while, I'd say, what? And I started to realize that more often than not, the problems weren't at least entirely the technology. It was more about the interactions and the interpersonal interactions and the interactions between people and technology. So we introduced a new technology, we introduced a new way of solving problems. That's kind of what got me into it. And in particular, when it came to teams, honestly, my own experience is working in teams, working in collaborations, trying to get stuff done, and then realizing that the dynamics of the team, the dynamics of the people and the way in which they think about things actually really played a big role in determining whether or not this stuff was successful in the first place. So I sort of retooled myself to go more into the psychology side of things and try to understand the original equipment as opposed to the technological stuff we were trying to build.
How do you think your background in engineering actually gave you a different perspective on organizational behavior than the people that you were studying with?
To be fair, a lot of people, when they see, hey, it's the organizational behavior guy coming, they have this sort of knee-jerk, allergic, slightly annoyed reaction of, kumbaya, let's hug and talk about feelings and this sort of stuff. But hey, we've got stuff to do. Engineering is about solving problems fundamentally, and that still is the core of what I love to do and what I want to do. So it gives me a perspective also of thinking about people not just as squishy things that are kind of arbitrary, but recognizing people follow rules in the same way as computer systems, social systems, you name it. And so I think it gives me an angle that is honestly sort of an engineering angle to understanding social dynamics and internally the sort of the wiring that we've got.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to jump right into kind of our central question, which is, why is it that otherwise ethical people do unethical things?
So I think you're asking exactly the right question when you start the framing by otherwise ethical people. I hear a lot of people with an overly simplistic, overly black and white view of, look, well, the reason bad stuff happened was there were bad people and bad people do bad stuff and thus we have bad. Yes, that does happen. And look, we can all point fingers to obvious, massively egregious failures and people who are doing really bad stuff. But more often than not, it's the smaller things, right? It's bad people sort of an easy and convenient scapegoat. What we have to remember is it tends to be things more like exogenous pressures. Every one of us in our job have pressures to deliver to given deadlines, pressures to succeed in our work, the pressures we put on ourselves about wanting to be good at our job and have that reputation, this sort of thing. Now, you take that and you add on to that, oh, by the way, this is also how you earn your living. So if you have a family that you are supporting, if you have any concerns out there in the world, other things that feed in, we operate under tremendous competing pressures, many of which are not perfectly aligned with ethical behavior. And let me be clear, I'm not saying they are necessarily unethical pressures, but if the pressure is you've got to deliver and you know, look, I can be sneaky and do something that's, well, not really sneaky, but look, everything's got gray areas. What if I push a little bit further to the left, just a little bit? It's what everybody's doing. That's where we start getting into the situation. And more often than not, it's about those pressures. And the other piece is it's almost always about small steps and escalation of commitment. It's very rare that a breach is something like, 0 to 60. We were completely ethical and everything was great. And then we decided to go off the deep end and do something horrid. More often than not, it's, look, we're behaving well. We push the bounds a little bit on this. And then, hey, guess what? Nothing happened. Nobody got hurt. It was really fine. Okay, maybe we can push the bounds a little bit further on the next one because we're still under the same pressure. And not only that, hey, we delivered last time. So everyone's going, hey, deliverer, deliver some more. We want to see more. It's that situation that we really have to, I think, protect much more against than looking for the real bad people who are doing terrible stuff in extreme cases.
I've never heard, is it escalation of commitments? I've never heard that. I've heard kind of a related discussion of normalization of deviance, of that idea that, it was fine last time and nobody got hurt and we'll just do it this way again, even though it's technically against the rules. It's fine until it's not. Yeah. So how do you counteract that? How do you, if you're an organization looking to kind of encourage people to resist the pressure to deviate, what do you do?
So two different things. One, I think we have to think about what are the right tools that we need. And here, obviously, part of what we're here to talk about is things like organizational culture. And I happen to believe that culture is one of the really most robust ways to tackle this. But the other thing is you have to put yourself more in the mindset, or at least from my perspective, of helping people. You have to put yourself in the mindset of how do we help people to maintain their ethical compass and to maintain that ethical behavior. And that means when they're feeling those pressures, are you giving them a release valve? Are you giving them a place that they can talk about that? Are you normalizing the conversation about the gray areas? Right? Sometimes we actually don't exactly know where the line is. And so if you don't know where the line is, you run into a very new or a different problem, which is you may be unethical accidentally. Now, one of the problems is when you know the organization is going, we're watching you, Tony, right there. Yeah, we're watching you and everything. The last thing you're going to do is say, I was thinking about this thing I might be doing and I'm not sure it might be unethical. No way, right? This is about psychological safety, about creating an environment. What you need to do is you need to create an environment where you say, look, we're going to talk about this. We're going to bring it to the surface and talk about how it's sometimes tough. And that's okay. It doesn't make you unethical to wrestle with this. The smart money is we help you to try to figure this out. And so I'm a big believer in process because, look, we have to outsource what we're bad at. Just relying on, I'll probably be ethical. I'm generally a good person. That you're giving yourself an unfair disadvantage. Outsource to a process. Say, look, once a week, we're going to have a roundtable where we talk about this stuff. We bring it to the surface. We put in place a process that there's for anything where I'm the one person making this call, where maybe I might make the wrong call. We have a check and a balance. I have to run it past one other person who's unconnected to the project, right? These are simple mechanical things, but one is normalizing the conversation. The other is giving people help to make the right ethical decisions and get into that.
One of the other things that you touched was surveillance and autonomy or lack of autonomy, and that feeling that it's you're accountable for and responsible for your decisions. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the impact of being closely watched may be, and kind of the counterpoint of what is it to have autonomy and how does that impact your behavior?
Look, this is where it gets tricky because some of it feels a little bit counterintuitive, right? Our logic would be, hey, when things are getting concerning, well, what do? Let's watch more so we make sure that we catch it. There are a couple of different things. One, you do run the risk that people, in effect, outsource their moral compass or they outsource their ethical awareness. Look, I don't have to worry about it because I know if I screw up, Tony's going to catch me. So I don't have to worry about it myself. That works great as long as Tony's always there to catch you. And this is part of the problem also. And this is what I was getting at around the idea of culture. One of my favorite stories was a CEO that ran a little experiment. There was an elevator that went up to his part of the floor, not only to him, but when you got up to the top floor, that was his place. He had somebody put a banana peel in the elevator and they just left it there. And then he stationed a couple of interns to watch and say, okay, so what's going to happen? Who's going to pick up the banana peel? The banana peel sat there for a while, a good chunk of the day, with people walking in going, oh. And this is a very substantial firm, revenues in the billions. And people would walk in, oh, that's gross. Look at the banana peel. Who would do that? Well, that's my floor, right? And they would get out of the elevator. And to me, it's a really illustrative example about the power of culture versus rules. If you have a culture of, we own this place, we care for this place, the first person who walks into that elevator should go, oh, that's gross. I don't know who did that, but I'm going to fix that because I feel a responsibility. If you rely on rules to do this, and surveillance is the rule approach. If you rely on those rules, you better make sure that you have a rule that says, when there is a banana peel in the elevator, thou shalt pick it up, including rider. If it's an orange peel, also pick it up. If it's a tangerine peel, also pick it up. Clementines, those are okay. You need to have sub-rules for every possibility. That's the problem when you rely, in effect, overly on the rules, is you give people the freedom or the right to not have to worry about it if it's not fitting into one of those categories. And that's the danger when it comes to especially challenges around ethics. How many times is the ethical breach a new thing? Very, very often. It's not the same breach that we've seen. It's, oh, well, now there's a new type of derivative that we have to think about in a slightly different way. And the cost, and there's something that maybe nobody even realized was a concern, but yet that's bad. That's why culture, in my mind, is the best way to approach it. Because if you instill in people a sense that they need to have ownership and they are responsible for maintaining the ethical standards of the organization, you also trust them to make the judgment call to say, you know what, we've never talked about this. This is making me feel a little bit weird. And again, if you created a culture where you talk about it, that's what comes up at the next meeting going, hey guys, have you ever thought about the fact that somebody could do this? And suddenly red flags and you catch something before it's ever happened. And that's why I think you need to have this interplay between the broader culture and the rules that you're putting in place. And you have to think about them in the way in which those pieces fit together.
So I have a couple of follow-ups to that. If you're able to create a culture in which someone is willing to say, hey, I haven't seen this before and I'm not sure about this, how can you make sure that that's heard and that's incorporated into decision-making?
You're hitting on exactly the right challenges of their questions, right? One is, do they raise it in the first place? So is it vocalized so that there's the possibility it gets picked up by people who can do something about it? The second is, when it's vocalized, is it actually heard? And do people then take that and say, whoa, we've got to be concerned, we need to do something with it? On the vocalization front, right, you need, again, to think about some more cultural things, psychological safety, things like that. Have you created an environment where people feel free to share? One of the critical drivers of that, you need to model that behavior at the top. You need to model vulnerability. You need to model and show, and this is some of the work that I did with Amy Edmondson around psychological safety. Obviously, she is the source of the great thinking around psychological safety. But you need to think about what is it that will make people feel comfortable and able to share that stuff. And that will get it into the conversation. Now, whether it gets heard, you've got a new set of problems, right? One, again, the same competing motivations I talked about in the beginning, those are there as well, right? Look, I've got an employee who's going on and on and on about this thing, and they're really worried about it. And I don't know, maybe it's a concern, maybe it's not. I've got competing pressures. Managers face the same ethical challenges that everybody else faces in terms of the pressures they're getting from their bosses and from laterally and from their employees. So again, you need to put in place some structures to in effect force the conversations to happen, to force the openness and the discussion around it so that people can take action. The other piece of the puzzle is all of these things require a certain amount of policing. Sounds bad. And when I say policing, I don't mean I'm going to watch you like a hawk and see what's happening. I mean, they require vigilance so that when these things come up, they are dealt with. Everybody listening knows how toxic it is or how devastating it is to any culture around, whether it's whistleblowing, ethical awareness, whatever it might be, when a complaint is raised and they feel like they aren't heard, right? I bring this to the top. Hey, guys, I've got a big warning flag. And people go, yeah. That's pretty damaging because I risked myself by potentially either foregoing something that could have been, maybe very lucrative or whatever else for me. Maybe I opened myself up, but certainly when it comes to whistleblowing, to retaliation, to all this other stuff. When you hear something, you have to show that it is heard and understood, and it has to be acted on. That doesn't mean you have to take any accusation. And so there's a balance there. You need to show that it's heard and acted on, and it needs to be acted on in a fair way, fair process that, look, as soon as we heard it, we took it seriously, we've documented it, we've started a process. Now, the process may go through and in the end say, look, it's actually okay, or this person did do something wrong. You need to make sure also that there's no retaliation going towards the person. They did what they thought was right. It was in everybody's best interest that we vocalize this, that we talk about it, and then we take it from there, but they feel like they've been heard. And that's what I mean by the policing. You need to take it seriously. You need to make sure that people feel that when they do follow the rules, when they do what you want them to do, that behavior is rewarded through recognition, through whatever else. I'm not talking monetary reward, but they feel validated for having taken that action.
Yeah. How about in cases where the issue isn't raised through formal channels? It's not like a whistleblowing incident. It's kind of just a person raising their hand in a meeting. And let's say the issue is not, let's say they're wrong. How do you handle that in this world in which you want to make sure that they're not afraid to raise their hand again?
Totally fair. And I'm really glad you're saying that because, again, people say, look, but we can't grind everything to a halt, to try to deal with every one of these different situations. Again, what is important is that people feel heard and that hearing is validated. Now, what that means is you need to have a way to explain to whatever is the person, whatever is the entity that's bringing it up, we've listened, we've heard it, we've evaluated it fairly, and we have reached this conclusion. Now, look, they may disagree with you. You may say, we've looked and this is actually okay. We've looked and we don't think this is malfeasance, whatever, bias, whatever it might be. They need to feel that that is clear. One of the ways that you can move in that direction is remember that the last thing you want to do is set policy when there's an issue on the table. So one of the ways to deal with this better is have a conversation before there's a potential breach or a concern or somebody's brought something up. Have the conversation now and say, look, here are the steps that we will take. If Tony brings something to the surface, we're going to do this, and this. And you get everybody to agree on, if we do these 4 steps, do we agree that that is good due process for how to handle these sorts of issues? Now, of course, if they say, I refuse, you're wrong, you can't please everybody. Not everybody will always be happy. But having that conversation out front is way, way better than waiting until you, Tony, raise something. And then we go through and at some point in the process decide, you know what, it's actually not a concern. You're never going to feel as validated. You get people to commit to the process beforehand without knowing what the outcomes will be. Then when they run through the process, it's a lot harder for them to push back beyond saying, look, did you do the process? You did? Then we're good.
I think you've kind of answered this question already. I think I know what your answer is, I'll say. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the kind of relative weight or importance of individual motivations versus group norms in decision making.
It's a tough one. In a certain sense, you're asking me to pit psychology versus sociology, right? The psychologists are going to say, look, it's about the original wiring and that stuff. And the sociologists will say, but look, the system affects how we behave. And my perspective is it is impossible to disentangle those. Go back to the examples I gave earlier on about motivations, right? What motivates you? What motivates me to do anything? Well, some of that is my own personal psychology, very much about personal motivations, what it means to be me. Where do you categorize family pressure? Well, my family wants certain things from me and not. Is that personal? It's kind of personal, but it's kind of not. It's also my family. It comes from other sources. So then we start getting a little bit in the middle. Then at the same time, there's broader societal pressures and where I sit in the community and my role. I think it is impossible to differentiate, and it is extremely idiosyncratic. There's a lot of research, for example, on identity. How do we think of ourselves? One of the very consistent findings, everybody has about as many identities as things that they look at in the day. I mean, you have so many. I have an identity of me as an academic, of me as a researcher, of me as a father, of me as a son, of me as maybe as a sibling or as whatever, all of these identities. And in any moment, one of them is triggered more or less than another one, and they're constantly moving around. That's why I think it's really hard when people say, well, which one is it? It isn't one. It's the mix of all of them. There may be a time, and coming back to what we're here to talk about when we talk about ethics, we talk about breaches, these sorts of things. At any point in time, hey, COVID hit, and by the way, you're now feeling really, really at risk for your job because the organization is going through a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe you feel a whole lot more pressure to stand out and to excel. That might be a really strong motivator to toe the line a bit more than you naturally would have. At a different point in time, you may be much more motivated by your own personal drivers. I'm passionate about this, or we all ebb and flow over time. It's impossible to pull those pieces apart. But I think what is useful is to give a little bit of thought to what are the different things pulling at you at any point in time. And I think that's a really good exercise for anybody to do. Sit down with a piece of paper and ask yourself, so what's motivating me now? It's kind of fun. You can do it now, you can do it in 6 months, and you may find it's not the same list.
That actually reminds me of, this famous study that was done with bankers testing their ethics, basically. And they were primed the first time they took the test. Well, they weren't primed with anything. They were just asked to take the test as a human being, right? And then the next time they took the test, they were primed as bankers. And they were shown to be far less ethical the second time around. And so I wonder what your perspective is on, is there something about financial services, about banking, that impacts the extent to which ethics are an issue in decision making?
You're trying to get me in trouble with everybody listening right now. This is not good. Do I think there's something intrinsic? I think that there are structural components in this. You're dealing with an entire industry in which pretty much everything you do feels, in a lot of respects, very black and white. Look, there are numbers on a piece of paper. It's in one column or it's in the other one, which I think for a lot of people obscures how gray this stuff can be. And look, I have colleagues, we have, at INSEAD, we have an accounting area, we have a finance area, and I have colleagues who spent their entire careers researching nuances of things that way beyond me and my comprehension. But the point being that black and white, it's not so black and white. But I do think that there's a little bit of that perspective that, but it's clear. It's not clear. And I think sometimes we underestimate how much gray area there is. On top of that, look, because of the success of the industry in terms of the financial rewards that it has paid over the years, particularly because that has been, it has the, Wolf of Wall Street, all of those sorts of examples. There is a rhetoric out there about the times of excess and the high flying. But in a certain respect, look, you also had some of those stories in other professions as well, back when they were making lots and lots, when doctors were making loads of money, with the doctors in the fast cars and doing never happened with professors. But, for the rest of when you're in a profession that is viewed as a high flying, one that others don't necessarily understand, high barriers to entry to those high levels, all of those things can create an environment where there's also hyper competition. People talk, we've got league tables. We know exactly who's ahead of whom, and that does breed some more competition. Now, does it breed more unethical behavior? I don't have the data. I mean, I'm an empiricist. You can also look at other things. I mean, you look at bad behavior among professional athletes. You look at bad behavior among anybody who is at the pinnacle of their career. I think that's more of what you see is as you go higher in a given career, you have both more opportunities and also more pressure to continue to deliver and deliver and deliver. And I think that's what pushes more of the unethical behavior. I don't think that in general, somebody who is a teller in a bank helping people to get loans or do whatever else on a day-to-day basis, I don't think that they feel significantly more pressure to be unethical than does somebody at a comparable level in another role, another industry.
You've talked about pressure a lot. Can you describe a little bit more the relationship between pressure and decision-making?
A number of years ago, we recognized that rational decision-making is a beautiful ideal. It's not a reality in any way, shape, or form. Now, in what ways are we irrational? So all of Dan Ariely's work and Predictably Irrational, everything, there's great work that shows that we have biases. So all of our great ideas on how to make decisions were broken. We have psychology. Our psychology doesn't fall into the nice buckets and do always the right thing. On top of that, you're always dealing with incomplete information, imperfect information. You've again got the biases. And now you add in all the pressures and everything else. Decision-making is nowhere near as nice and objective a category as we like to think it is. So, in terms of what's the relationship between pressure and decision-making, given that you've got a lot of different things in play, the more pressure you put on the system, the more likely it is that you end up making a shortcut, either intentionally or otherwise, and you don't do the step-by-step testing of everything. And that's where we start to get to these suboptimal decisions. One of my favorite books, Pfeffer and Sutton wrote The Knowing Doing Gap, and they're basically arguing that, more or less, hyper-simplified, most of the errors that we make are errors that we wouldn't make if we actually took the time and stopped and reflected and thought through this stuff.
So my last question on this is, if you're an organization looking to improve decision-making in your organization, it sounds like you'd be well served to figure out where there are points of high pressure and where your staff is really feeling under pressure for whatever reason. It sounds like pressure in one area can translate into behaviors in a different area. How would you recommend figuring that out?
Conversations. Now I'm belying the organizational behavior piece, and I said, I'm an engineer. It's not all the warm and fuzzy and stuff. I'm sorry. The best tool you still have is a conversation. It's not just let's have to get the CEO to say, hey, everybody, tell us where you're under pressure. That doesn't work. This has to be at the level of the operating unit, right? The team level, where there are real relationships. If this is something that you're really thinking about, you're worried about that pressure, managers need to have that conversation and say, look, let's talk about this. And again, model the behavior you want to see. If you want people to honestly tell you about their stressors, their pressures, the things that are pushing them, especially if you think that those might be things that are pushing them towards behavior that they don't feel good about, you better be coming up with some examples of your own. That's a tough bill of sale for a lot of leaders to start off by saying, so let me tell you about a time where I probably got a bit too close to the gray line. Most leaders will say, absolutely not. No way. I'm not going there. That's But if you really want people to be open and honest, you need to take that first step. You are in a position of power and safety relative to them. Use that for some good by saying, look, I'm going to reveal where it was tough for me. And that's a first step, not the whole step, but a first step towards getting people to say, you know what? I kind of had something similar, or here's what I'm wrestling with, right? But again, it has to be real vulnerability, not the one that we use when we're applying for a job. What's your biggest flaw? I'm too dedicated. Like, come on. It's not that. It's real vulnerability. It's actually doing the stuff that matters.
So let's get into your sweet spot. How would you say the pandemic has changed the way that people make decisions?
There's been a lot of debate, honestly, going back and forth. A lot of people started saying, look, people are a lot more productive because I'm not distracted by all the stuff going on. That chatty person in the office who's always talking at me. I don't waste time with commuting. I don't. Look how much more productive I am. At the same time, we have to be careful, right? There's productivity and then there's collaboration. And it depends on what kind of productivity you're looking for. So what I've been seeing, yes, I think people are more productive, at least in terms of also hours put in. We also know, and there's lots and lots of data that shows people everywhere across the world working longer hours. They start earlier, they end later. That's more hours in the day. They take less time for lunch. We also know, and we've known this since, like the 80s, that when people communicate via technology, they tend to be more task focused. So we're more scheduled, we're hyper scheduled, we are more task focused. It's not surprising that people say, so I am more productive. In a certain respect, we are. The problem is we have to be careful of what we're losing. So if what you're losing is more collaborative work that you need to get other people's opinions on, right? Come back to the focus of our conversation here, talking about ethics. Maybe you have an environment where people are able to produce more widgets and whatever that might be, sell more accounts or settle more deals, whatever it might be. They're able to deliver more, but they spend less time talking to other people about it. That could be a very big red flag for ethical breaches. It was really funny. I was talking with this guy about this deal that we were closing, and he said that you could actually write off a certain something. And I hadn't thought about it that way. And you chime in and say, whoa, no. I actually just learned about this, or I just talked about this. That's actually not okay. You can't write that off because of whatever. Those random communications may stop me from doing something that could get me in trouble, could get the firm in trouble, could whatever else. So are you more productive? Yeah, you got more stuff done, but maybe you're missing out on the opportunities, collaborative opportunities to catch stuff. Same thing goes obviously also for innovation. Innovation is a team sport. We know this. The idea of Newton just being, the apple on the head, the bolt of lightning, the eureka moment. Does it happen? Yeah. Does it happen often? No. Does it happen most of the time? No. Collaboration is typically the vehicle of innovation, where we talk about things. We use analogic learning. I take something I learned from over here and I plug it in over there, and that fits with this piece. And now suddenly we've got a new solution. The more people are working remotely, we have to be much more cognizant of the stuff that we've lost, right? And I always tell people, you have to pay for the stuff that used to come for free. We need to stop and make sure we've done the shopping list, the inventory list of the stuff we used to get, and then think about how we can put it back in, because otherwise it really does start to affect the way in which we're reaching our decisions. Some of it may be positive, some of it may very much not be.
You basically get a higher quantity of decisions, but probably lower quality of decisions, even when it's not an ethical question.
Let's be clear. I guarantee right now somebody's listening going, no, that's not true. I've cranked out lots of stuff and I've been totally ethical. Sure, you may have been. Again, remember, when we talk about ethics, when we talk about ethical breaches, in the same way as when we talk about innovations and other things, it's a numbers game, and you have to ask yourself, what's the cost of a failure? Just like a venture capital firm doesn't expect to get a unicorn every time they fund something, one unicorn funds all the other stuff. Same thing goes for ethical things. Just because you didn't have an ethical breach doesn't mean that you're not at risk or there isn't a problem. Maybe you got lucky. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you're totally fine. But it's a question of how conservative, how risk averse do you really want to be? And then you have to balance that out.
So what have we missed in terms of any recommendations that you have for organizations that are looking to build in more ethical decision-making?
I come back to the same two things. So I sound a bit like a broken record. I'm a huge fan of all of Amy Edmondson's work around psychological safety, not just because she is an amazing scholar and a truly delightful person, but because she's absolutely right. One of the best ways that you can avoid breaches and basically failures in the decision process, whether they're ethical breaches or not, they can also be planes falling out of the sky. They can be surgical goofs. They can be, whatever. The foundation of that is open conversation to surface when something goes wrong, right? It comes back to what I was saying before. Step one, the issue has to be surfaced so that you know that there's something to talk about. Then step two is, how do you deal with that? Psychological safety is the fundamental underpinning of that. It is an attribute of an organization. It's a cultural thing. It is something that you can build over time. It is something that is personally felt. You do or don't feel psychologically safe. And whether you do or don't, I have no control over that. I mean, I can influence, I can do things to try to make you feel more psychologically safe. But look, if you, Tony, just don't feel safe psychologically around me, There's nothing I can do to change that. That is you who owns that. But we can create environments that on average raise the level of psychological safety, create an environment where people are more willing to bring these issues to bear. So what can organizations do? One, take that seriously and really invest in it. Invest in building a culture where people are talking about it. What you want is a place in which people say, look, I'm willing to say, I'm not sure if I just did something wrong. Can somebody help me? Because I know that they're going to say, wow, Mark, you totally screwed up. That was really not okay. We're not going to judge you for it. We're going to try to help you fix it, and we're going to do something about it. So I think psychological safety from a cultural standpoint, and then again, think about process. Remember, outsourcing what you're bad at. Think about putting in place the things, not in terms of monitoring, but in terms of helping people to be more honest and open and have those discussions. I think that's really at the crux of what is necessary.
If I were a CEO of a relatively big organization, is that you have subcultures, right? And some of them might be subcultures that are psychologically safe. I might feel safe in one environment with one set of people, but not in a separate one, or not. That might be a subset of a larger environment in which I don't feel psychologically safe. How would you recommend organizations try and understand whether they have a psychologically safe environment?
It is a process. Again, it is something that you create by modeling the right behavior, by showing exemplars, by keeping your eyes open and making sure that when something comes up, it is truly dealt with and people feel like, they actually take this seriously. But at the end of the day, it's like parenting. You can do everything. You try your hardest to instill the right values and all the stuff. They're still their own people. Sometimes they don't do exactly what you wanted them to do. Frustrating as that might be, and I think that's the reality. I think leaders need to be thinking about this from the perspective of saying, look, I'm going to prioritize this. I'm going to send strong signals to the organization that I legitimately and sincerely think this is a priority. And I'm going to do everything I can to try to instill that. I'm also going to recognize that it might not work 100%. It might not work in certain pieces. There might be subcultures and everything else. I don't close my eyes. We say, look, we're going to create psychological safety to bring these ideas to these issues to the surface. We are also going to keep our eyes open to make sure that we're keeping an eye out. And if we see something that's going wrong, we say, hey, what's going on over there? A little funky thing in the gray over there. That doesn't feel right. And, again, as long as that is part of the contract up front, employees can't really complain about you keeping your eyes open. You're looking after your own job, and that's your job. The main thing is making sure that, again, those conversations, that contract, implicit, explicit, is up front. You make sure that gets set and is clear before there's an issue on the table, because as soon as there's an issue on the table, it pollutes the whole discussion, and you can't disentangle the two.
What resources would you recommend on these topics if people want to dig further?
I'm Amy's cheerleading section. Fearless Organization is a fantastic book. Again, it gets people thinking about these sorts of issues. What I like is, again, it's important to be able to ground these in reality. It's not just an abstract thing. It is, let's actually see where this comes in over and over and over. And what is the concrete impact of this on people's real behavior? Because that's really what matters. Culture doesn't matter for culture. Culture matters for the behavior that it drives.
All right, Mark, our last question is kind of a fun one. It doesn't have to be about culture. What are you reading, watching, listening to that you're really enjoying, that you want to tell the world about? It could be anything.
I love Ted Lasso. It is a great show for two reasons. So I love it because it's really funny. But the nerd answer is it's all about working across cultures, which is something I happen to be passionate about. You have a sports setting, but it's working US, UK, etc. But it's also all about the power of positivity and kindness, which I think we need a lot more of. So it's kind of a feel good. It's silly. It's funny. It is really funny. That's kind of what's on my mind at the moment. I'm really enjoying it.
Thank you. Is there anything we didn't cover, Mark, that you want to make sure to include?
No, I think this is a great conversation. I had a lot of fun. I encourage people just to think about this stuff in a weird way. It's not rocket science. It's just something that we don't often give the time it needs to actually reflect. We have, as a society and industry, a huge action bias towards we got to get stuff done. Things have to be happening. A little bit more thought wouldn't always be the worst thing. huge grain of salt. I'm an academic. It's what I do all the time as I sit and nerd out and think about things all the time. But a little bit of a pause, 80-20 rule, I think can give a lot of benefit. Look, this is what we also know about behavior change. Behavior change, cultural change, neither one is achieved through, in a certain sense, like big actions of, I will now be this going forward. No, you won't. You were something else up until now for a lot of good reasons. Behavior change is accomplished through small nudges, through small shifts, repeated over and over and over. We're creatures of habit. Sometimes you just need to force yourself into that new habit, do it enough, and eventually that becomes the way you think. That's really the game that we're in right now.
Thanks so much, Mark. It was really good to see you again.
Great to see you too. Thanks so much for having me.
If you want to hear more from Mark, watch the New York Fed's webinar on culture in a post-pandemic workplace, which you'll find at newyorkfed.org/governance and culture reform.